1. The T-72 and T-80 tanks, and even the BMPs, couldn't elevate their guns enough to hit the upper floors of buildings, and they couldn't depress them enough to hit RPG teams firing from basements. The Chechens knew this, and that's exactly why they positioned their small fire teams there. At 50 meters, the tank gun couldn't hit anything above roughly the 4th floor, and they were surrounded by tall buildings on all sides in narrow streets. The side, rear, and top armor couldn't stop even the older RPG-7 warheads, especially not when showered by them from all directions at almost point-blank range. Tanks and vehicles brewed up, and yeah, that infamous signature turret launch of the T-72 series, the so-called jack-in-the-box effect that you've seen in Ukraine today, was no better back then. Many of these tanks either didn't have explosive reactive armor at all, or those that did, well, it didn't actually work. A lot of them were urgently deployed, and the explosive inserts of the ERA blocks were never put in. And even the tanks that did have working reactive armor had the older Contact 1, which can't stop tandem warheads or repeated hits anyway. Simply, there is no protection for a tank when it drives blindly in packet formation into a city without proper support, which is something that commanders tend to do in almost any war for some reason. The infantry inside the BMPs was paralyzed by shock. They were supposed to dismount and support the tanks, but they didn't get out. As we said, they were mostly young conscripts with zero urban warfare training. No one even told them what to do, so their instinct was to stay behind the armor when the shooting started. And horribly, many of them stayed inside. Forever. Chechen fighters walked up to buttoned-up vehicles and blew them up with RPGs. Those who tried to bail out of burning vehicles were cut down by machine guns and snipers. The brigade commander Savin stayed in command despite being wounded himself, calling for any help they could get over the radio, but there was no help on the way. The frantic fighting continued throughout the night. Russian commanders inside the city tried to form some sort of defense, but the complete chaos, confusion, and lack of any plan whatsoever made this impossible. They were communicating over old radios that were unencrypted, and the Chechens, having the same radios, could just listen to everything the Russians were saying in a language they spoke fluently themselves. They could even talk to the Russian forces like you've seen. There is that recording of a Chechen fighter laughing over the Russian radio frequency that I came across while doing the research, and it scared the life out of me, let alone the soldiers that were actively getting killed by them that listened to this. On the other side, the Chechen fighters were well organized. They had at the time new Motorola handheld radios for almost each team. They could communicate without Russians listening, and given the fact that they were defending their own city, they were far more motivated. Their defense was organized in 3 concentric rings, and the Russians didn't have any idea about that when they drove in parade style. It was just a mess and an impossible situation for Russian soldiers that were now fighting for their lives through the night. Their present for New Year was a ceasefire 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after midnight. Then the slaughter continued. The 131st Support Battalion entered the city, but was immediately ambushed and wiped out before they could even reach the soldiers surrounded at the train station. Through the night, wounded and dead were piling up. Ammo was running out, and there was no way out of it. On the morning of January 1st, Russian jets and helicopters came in to help. However, they helped by bombing their own Western group that was supposed to participate in the attack, because no one told the pilots about them being there. So they mistook them for the enemy and hit them with cluster munitions, creating a horrible friendly fire incident, taking out several vehicles and tens of friendly soldiers. The chaos was so bad that it is estimated that friendly fire accounted for as high as 60% of all Russian casualties. Even if they got that wrong by half, it is still more than horrible. And if that wasn't enough, some Chechen fighters took Russian uniforms and, as they fluently spoke the language, infiltrated the lines and caused even more chaos. 2 Russian units were fighting each other for 6 hours on January 1st, because Chechen fighters got in between them through the sewer system and fired on both sides, then just left and let them fight each other. Same goes for the radio communication and orders. Reinforcements that tried to move into the city were not only taking fire from Chechen fighters, but also from Russian soldiers who were now in complete disarray and fired on everything that moved. Both sides had the same equipment, vehicles, and weapons, and there was no way to accurately identify friendlies before they were too close, or too late to see the mistake. By January 1st, the 131st had been trapped at the station for roughly 24 hours. They had between 300 and 350 already killed. They were going out of ammo and the wounded couldn't be helped anymore. Surrender was pretty much out of the question for most soldiers, as those who tried to surrender were mostly shot on the spot. Some were captured and then had an even worse fate than that, while some were captured, treated if wounded, and then released later even without ransom for Chechen prisoners. It all depended on the unit they came across and their commander. Now, it was obvious that no help was coming for them. At sundown on January 1st, Savin was still in command and decided to try to evacuate the wounded. He placed about 40 of the most critically injured onto the last 3 operational vehicles and dispatched them. The vehicles drove drove out but went in the wrong direction, toward the city center instead of away from it. They eventually turned around and tried to retreat back the way they came, but were immediately ambushed by Chechen RPG teams. None of the vehicles made it out of the city. 13 of them survived to be taken prisoner. The command back at headquarters, desperate, told the surrounded soldiers to take civilian hostages to negotiate their extraction. However, the Chechens didn't respond. They also suggested the trapped troops try to sneak to friendly lines under cover of darkness, like if they couldn't think of that themselves. It is now January 2nd, and surviving Russian soldiers were barely holding on, fighting for their lives. Buildings were shattered by RPGs, and hand grenades were thrown in. It was just close quarters fighting, getting more desperate by each hour as the Russians were now almost completely out of ammo. Colonel Savin, himself wounded since nearly the start of the battle, made the call on his own, without waiting for orders from above, to abandon the station and leave the city on foot under cover of darkness. They left the station on January 2nd after dark, moving along the railroad ties. They got about 70 meters out, and the Chechens didn't pursue them. The order was total silence and no shooting, but nerves broke and discipline started falling apart. People were shell-shocked, exhausted, some barely functioning. While moving through the city, they stumbled upon 3 BMPs from a different unit, the Samara Regiment. Savin ordered the most critically wounded loaded onto these vehicles and sent them driving out. The first BMP, carrying Savin himself and the worst wounded, was hit by a grenade launcher almost immediately. Savin was mortally wounded and died shortly after, beside his wrecked vehicle. He was posthumously awarded Hero of the Russian Federation for trying to save what was left of his unit. The second BMP, with the wounded, was also hit and destroyed, while the third one managed to push through but was hit again just a bit down the road. Those who had survived either ran out on foot or were captured later wandering around the city. From the Chechen side, around 120 of their fighters were killed near the station alone. The whole thing lasted 60 hours. By January 3rd, from the 131st alone, there were 789 men killed, 75 captured. Only about 160 reached safety. 20 of 26 tanks destroyed. 102 of 120 armored vehicles destroyed. All Tunguska anti-aircraft systems destroyed. 24 officers dead, including Savin. The entire 1st Battalion, roughly 300 men and 40 armored vehicles, ceased to exist. Across all units in the opening days, an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 Russian soldiers were killed. Around 100 of 120 tanks committed were destroyed. Russia proportionally lost more tanks in Grozny than in the Battle of Berlin in 1945. 1,906 Russian soldiers from the First Chechen War remain listed as missing in action. In 2008, a mass grave containing roughly 800 bodies was uncovered in Grozny. After the disaster, they completely abandoned armored columns. They shifted to massive artillery bombardment, firing an estimated 30,000 shells per day. This was the heaviest bombardment campaign in Europe since the Second World War, and this killed thousands of civilians, most of them Russian ethnics that had nowhere to go. Through the next month, they horribly bombed the city and attacked with infantry until the Chechen defenders retreated to the mountains and the Russians took the city. It was taken back by the Chechens in 1996 in a counterattack, after which they began negotiations. But the Second Chechen War would come in 1999 under Putin, where they used the lessons learned and leaned over to heavy bombardments instead of driving in with tanks. The city was yet again destroyed, and Russia won this time, installing their controlled government. So, there you go. Another example of people dying because someone in their comfy offices disagreed over something.